Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, we have a very special guest. Her name is Mary Louise Roberts, and she just published a book in April of 2021. The title of the book is Sheer Misery, Soldiers in Battle in World War II. And Mary Louise Roberts, who likes to go by Lou, she is the Wharf Distinguished Lucy Albrecht Professor and Planner Bascom Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has her PhD from Brown University and a master's from Sarah Lawrence College. This is not her first book. She's also written Disruptive Acts, The New Woman in Fin de Siècle, France, published March 15th, 2017. Also, D-Day Through the French Eyes, Memoirs of Normandy, 1944, published 2014. What Soldiers Do, Sex in the American GI in World War II France, 2013. And then she was also involved in a book titled Civilization Without Sexes, Reconstructing Gender in Post-War France, 1917-1929. That was published in 2009. But again, the title of this book is Sheer Misery. Really a fascinating book. It's a different kind of historical take on books I usually read, where it's really, she goes in detail about the life of the infantrymen in World War II and sees the war from that perspective, really kind of in the trenches perspective, but she can talk more about that. So Lou Roberts, are you there?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me on, William. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people, I mean, you have a background with a lot of books. For people who may not have heard your background, can you talk about your interest in World War II and what led you to write this book, Sheer Misery?
Sure. I began as a French historian. And what I'm interested in is using different kinds of archives from different countries to get new narratives. So my book, What Soldiers Do, I use both American archives concerning GIs and French archives concerning French women and men and civilians. And the perspective you get if you look at both sides is different, sort of evades the sort of, I don't know, maybe overly nationalist view of American history without the other side. So when I wrote What Soldiers Do, it was a pretty controversial book. And I remember at one outing, a veteran came up to me and said, you know, I don't know why you're so critical of American soldiers, because you really don't know what war is like. You have no idea. You're in your ivory tower. And I thought, you know, it's really true. That's a great point. I don't know what war is like. And one of the things I had noticed when I started reading the infantry memoir literature is that for American GIs and other Allied troops, this was not about strategy and tactics. You know, the amount of strategy or tactics you knew was basically what your commander told you. Go up hill 751 or go down to this creek. So unlike a lot of military histories that deal with strategy and tactics, these memoirs are overwhelmingly concerned with their bodies, and in particular, their miserable bodies. And it occurred to me that if I wanted to see or really understand what it was like to fight in a war, I needed to attend to that part of the war, the kind of miserable bodily experience that soldiers were having. And so that's what led to this book. And I really deal with all the senses in this book. What it's like to hear, what it's like to smell the front, what's it like to see a dead body, what's it like to smell a dead body, and what is it like to eat on the front? What food do you get? All those different bodily experiences, as well as the cold and the mud, and then finally the dead body, which is another thing that nobody talks about. What happens to the dead bodies that get left on the field? So that's where it came from, the book.
Right. And I mean, it is an important focus because I think in your introduction, you show that these infantrymen are really just seen as bodily units by their perspective or select or whatever military they're involved in. So they're tested size and shape, height for this thing. Can you talk about how they were prepped for going into the trenches?
Sure. So from the moment that, and this is the main theme of the book, really, from the moment that soldiers enter into training camp, they become sort of bodies for the United States Army, and every single part of them are plucked and tested. The British, for example, had basically a sort of factory line with different kinds of doctors looking at different parts of their bodies, including their genitals, and making measurements and so on and so forth. And so the soldier begins to realize that the way he looks at his body and the way that his trainer or eventually his commander is going to look at his body are completely different. For him, he's a body that's embodied, a sensate being. But for the Army, increasingly, he sees that he is a unit, a bodily unit of violent force, and that he becomes in some way a pin on a map, abstracted. So the book really reels between those two poles, between how a soldier sees his own body and experiences war in a bodily way, and how a commander like Patton sees his soldiers not as embodied, but as bodies which can wield violent force. That's the main theme of the book.
Right, and it is interesting. So there's a difference between the officers and the generals, and these grunts or dog faces, I think you called them in the book, and their perceptions and the kind of general's perceptions of them. I mean, can you talk about what? I mean, I think that you vividly depict how what an assault on the human senses were for somebody to be in that war. Can you talk about all of those impacts on the individual infantrymen?
Sure. Sound, smell, and taste are the three that I deal with in the first chapter. Sounds of war were really strategic for an Allied soldier on the front, because he became very skilled at figuring out what different kinds of sounds were and what they meant. So in a blind battlefield, and by that I mean a battlefield in which artillery is placed too far back in order to locate it on the battlefield, sounds become in some way the map, the way in which a soldier can measure his distance from, incoming artillery or mortars or so on and so forth. So soldiers became really skilled at learning an incoming and an outcoming fire, what the difference was, as well as the differences between a German machine gun and an American machine gun. There was no moral or ethical meaning to sound. It was strategic. But smell was different that way. It was much more of a moral issue, because smell had, in Western societies anyways, increasingly been equated with moral depravity. So when you started to smell, and soldiers really did smell, there was a kind of stigma attached to it, and soldiers would talk about the smelly German, the Germans, as a way to deprave them. But the other thing about sound that's really interesting is that it, in some way, if sound was something that was gonna come, smell was something that had come and gone. And in some ways it transcribed the war's chaos, because the smell of the battlefield combined both the weaponry and the effect of the weaponry. So the smell of the battlefield was cordite and burnt human flesh, both the cause and effect of a piece of artillery or another piece of ammunition. And so in some ways, the chaos of war gets transcribed through those two particular smells.
And sorry to interrupt, but you said, like, in the book, you retell one infantryman who said, like, those smells were vivid for him, even decades after the war. He still remembered. So there's like a hypersensitivity to all those things that happened. and like they learned to tell the sound of what weapon it was. The howitzer, I think you mentioned the German 88 millimeter was something.
Yeah, and the screaming Mimis was another one that they all hated. But interesting thing, William, happens to me when I give some version of this talk, and if there are veterans in the room, you know, it evokes all kinds of memories. It's so interesting. They come up and say, "Oh my God, for me, it wasn't cordite. It was, you know, the smell of anesthesia or the smell of alcohol in hospitals." You know, so smell is so evocative. And really important in evoking memories. And then finally, taste. So food was bad. But, you know, people, the United States in general, I focus on the British and the United States, excuse me. And they tried to make it good. But the challenge was such that they had to send food all over the world, the United States quartermaster, in all kinds of climates, from the coldest to the hottest. And they really created food that was more functional than it was tasteful. So, for example, they created a Hershey's chocolate bar, and they designed it so that it would be no more tasteful than a boiled potato. And the reason was because they didn't want a GI to eat it all at once. They wanted the GI actually to find it so distasteful that they would eat it over time and therefore reserve their energy. So those are some of the senses that I talked about.
Right. And you talk about these guys eating these with C and K rations. I think there's a picture of one of them in the book. Yeah. And they just look terrible, like crackers that look inedible. But that's making them fantasize about the opposite of a really nice meal or some stew or things. So you see what that feeling is in the trenches of them enduring all of this kind of hardship and not having all the niceties of maybe being somewhere else. But you also talk about the overstimulation of the senses too, where people lose their minds and senses too in there. Can you talk about that?
Sure. First of all, on the first point you made, William, I just want to say there was a USGI called Leroy Stewart. I think he's my favorite of all. You know, I've read hundreds of these memoirs, but Leroy Stewart is my favorite. And he had a recurring dream when he was in the trenches, which was he wakes up in the hospital and right in front of him is a steaming plate of mashed potatoes with gravy in it. And all he has to do all day long is eat the mashed potatoes. So those are the kind of fantasies these men had. Okay, and then the other question? Sorry, I forgot.
Oh, no, I mean, but like some of these people clearly had like the 1,000-yard stare.
Oh, yeah.
They develop it over time, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, eventually mostly sound, but also the sight of combat and the danger of combat. Just created a situation for them where they're overstimulated, and in some ways their senses are shot, and that is the 1,000-yard stare. So ultimately, that's what war does to them, which is to create a kind of situation where they're sensing too much and can no longer sense at all.
Right, and I mean, so there's the sounds of the dead, sounds of the wound, the silence of the dead, sounds of the wound. I think you wrote in there that the planes at 1,500 feet could smell the bodies of the dead. So yeah. You don't get those sensations from a Hollywood film. And one of the real interesting sections that in your book was chapter 2, kind of the dirty body, was kind of General Patton's conflict with a cartoonist by the name of Maldon. Can you talk about that?
Sure. You know, not much has been written about Bill Maldon. He received the Pulitzer Prize for cartoonery in 1944. It was considered to be the most important cartoonist of the war in the United States. And what's interesting to me about his cartoons is that he has a pair called Willie and Joe, and they're both infantrymen, and they're both filthy, absolutely filthy. By the end of the war, so many GIs wanted to be Willie and Joe that they started to buy used infantry clothing And as Maldon said, if it had a bullet hole in it, then it was golden. You could get an incredible amount of money for it. So I looked at this phenomena of guys wanting to be dirty, and I realized that what Maldon had done with his cartoonery, his cartoons, was he had transformed the meaning of dirt. So again, dirt, like smell, had certain moral and ethical meanings, which meant, that you were a dirty, George Orwell said of the working class, that they were dirty and they smelled. So when GI started to get dirty, and they did particularly in the Italian campaign of the fall and winter of 1943, as they traveled north upward the country, they got incredibly dirty in the mountains, and they had a shortage of water as well in the mountains, and so they couldn't wash themselves. And I talk about this one moment where two GIs meet one another and they don't recognize each other because they're so dirty, and both of them feel incredible amounts of shame about being so dirty. And I take that situation and then I look at Maldon and think, oh, you know what he did? He actually reversed the meaning of dirt, so that the average Joe on the line who's dirty, he's the real hero. He's the real warrior. He's William Joe. He's doing all the fighting. And then Maldon would also portray officers, rear front officers, in particular staff sergeants, as pristinely clean. And so in some ways, if the new meaning of dirt was heroism and you're really out there, you're the warrior fighting the war, the new meaning of clean was you're a sissy and you haven't really seen war and you have it easy. So in that really brilliant way, and he's an absolutely hilarious cartoonist, he reversed the meanings of dirt and cleanliness. So I think as a way to make soldiers less ashamed of their dirt and more proud.
Right. And you include a couple of his cartoons in the book, and I saw those. Like one is two dirty guys driving by a sign that says, so and so and so, and they said, we're going to get fined $1,000 or something. But also, Patton didn't like Maldon's depiction, right? So the dirt for him was a sign of, insubordination, right?
Yeah, no, Patton was actually, I think, exceptionally stringent about cleanliness among his soldiers. So he had a particular bugaboo about Maldon, because here is Maldon not only popularizing, but really sanctifying dirt. And he decided, this is in the early part of 1945, he decided that he was not going to allow Stars and Stripes into the Third Army unless Maldon took these cartoons out. And Stars and Stripes actually was it's a fantastic newspaper. And it was actually semi-autonomous because Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander of the effort, he decided that only a semi-autonomous, mostly independent newspaper would actually be trusted and read by the GIs. So just because Patton demanded that Maldon's cartoon be taken out, there was a lot of pushback. And the pushback, of course, was from the soldiers who adored Maldon for, sort of making, again, dirt less shameful and more heroic. And so they knew there would be a huge uproar about this. And so what they did is they sent Maldon. Maldon was a little guy, actually, and he was in Italy in the 36th. And then once he started doing cartoons for Stars and Stripes, he would follow different troops around in the Jeep. So they got him to Paris, and I can't remember where Patton was, probably Rheims at that time. And they polished him up, cleaned him to a shine, essentially, and had him sent by Jeep over to Patton's office. And no sooner is he in the door than Patton starts yelling at him. And he takes a cartoon out of his drawer and says, well, I can't even say what Patton says without, he had a very foul mouth. Let's
Is
put it
in
that
character, right? In Patton's
way.
character.
Yeah, he was in character, exactly. And so the long and short of it was that Maldon just sort of shifted feet on the carpet for 45 minutes and then got out and was allowed to continue his cartoon, much to Patton's disapproval. So it's a really good example of how Stars and Stripes did have autonomy during the war. And, Patton, there was a historian named Paul Fussell who said to him, that many of his soldiers died with their ties tucked in between their second and third button. So in some ways, it was typical of Patton to think about cleanliness as order and discipline, and dirt as something out of order and therefore seditious.
Right, and it was kind of interesting. You tell this story about Churchill and Patton really wanting to urinate on stuff in Germany. Like, there's a lot of bodily functions issues in that warfare.
Yeah, no, I was particularly interested in that. It wasn't only Churchill and Patton. It was every single soldier who hit the Rhine would urinate in it. And I use it at the very beginning of the book to show how meaning is attached to bodily functions, like urinating and defecating. And defecating was always a source of shame. If someone, defecated in their pants, he was a coward. And in fact, oftentimes people who were called cowards were called pant shitters. So it was a sign of weakness and cowardice. But urination was the opposite. It was the sign of power. So when Churchill reached the Rhine, he wanted to piss in it to show that he had reached the Rhine, that the German army had retreated now behind German border, because the Rhine is what separates, Eastern France and Belgium from Germany proper. So Churchill did it, and he did it very discreetly. And then, of course, Patton had to do it. But Patton did not do it discreetly. He got a photographer to take a photograph of him urinating in the Rhine.
Which is in your book, right?
Which is in my book, yes. It's not a pornographic image. It's done from a distance. And then after he did it, of course, every British and American soldier urinated in the Rhine. And I love to tell this story when I was actually in Switzerland a few years ago on the Rhine. And we're swimming in the Rhine, and I started telling this story, which did not go over well with the Swiss that I was dealing with.
Yeah. But it was all symbolic, too. And also, like dysentery, diarrhea, these were all very common issues in the front from both sides, right?
Yes. In fact, the phrase "I have the GIs" came from this particular situation, and it's not that the army, the Allied army, didn't try to make it as clean as possible, but when you're living and working outside all the time, your food is just going to be infected with bugs carried by flies and other insects. So there were latrines, and after the latrines were used and the army moved on, they were closed up. And in fact, I have one wonderful story about an older French person. And he was on a Normandy field where a division had been, and he looked at all these grave sites that said "Rest in peace, rest in peace," and he couldn't understand. He kneeled down and he gave his respects. He said a sign of the cross, and then he realized that it was a joke, that the GIs had actually buried their latrine there, and they were bidding their shit rest in peace, and so on and so forth. So he felt a little foolish about saying a prayer over a buried latrine. So all these things are, they really made an effort, but it was inevitable that there would be diarrhea, the GIs, as they were called.
And it goes back to the theme of your book, the body, and also the lack of care really for cold, that it seems like the generals or the officers had for the individuals. It seems like that was just as big as the enemy as the Germans, and they didn't really attend to that. It seems like they talked about it, but they didn't really seem to address it. At least that's the impression I got from your book.
Yeah, and the end result of that was something called trench foot, which was pretty legion in the United States Army in the winter of 43, 44. First in Italy, and then 44, 45 at Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge. So a lot of it was bad boots, unlike the British, who had great boots after getting trench foot in Legion numbers in the First World War. And another is bad distribution. What would happen is boots, really good boots or rubber coverings, would come in to bases, either ports or other bases, and they would be cherry picked. And they would be cherry picked by officers and also people who worked on the docks. And a lot of time they would be put on the black market in Italy, in particular. And so then, finally the boots would get to the infantry who really needed them, and there would be size 5 or size 14, and that was it. So a lot of infantrymen had to go unprotected in terms of their feet, or they had to wear boots that were too small, which was another kind of hell. So the cold, the wet, and living in the elements was hard enough, but many of them also had to have their feet amputated because they were so badly infected with trench foot.
And I think you showed one vignette of like a whole bucket of feet that had been amputated. And I think that's really a credit to your book too, is you have so many first-person vignettes about people's experiences in the trenches. Really is fascinating reading. But they also, part of the problem too was that it was a matter of toughness not to complain about any physical problems in the trenches. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So one of the things that Allied soldiers were taught in training camp, both British and American soldiers, was something that I call endurance. And I actually, last year, I was a visiting professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point. And I saw this firsthand. What they do to the cadets when they first come in a summer training program is they push them to their absolute physical limits. And the same was true of Army training camps. And I remember at West Point, one incredibly hot day, probably 105 degrees. I walked out with a major, and all these cadets are out there on this field, boiling hot, and they're in full gear, full uniform and hats. And I said to the major, this just must be absolutely hell, to be in a long-sleeved uniform, exercising in 105-degree heat. And, the major said, well, that might be true, but the last thing you would never, ever do is complain or excuse yourself. So these kinds of endurance effects were training for Allied soldiers. And so what soldiers learned to do was to ignore bodily alarms. One of them, pain, obviously. Another one, excessive sweating. I mean, these are all the ways your body alarms you to the fact that it is extremely stressful. And this was particularly important for men, I would add, because men in both the UK and in the United States were expected to be stoical and to not complain. And certainly not cry. So both the effective training and learning how to ignore your bodily alarm systems and the really strongly felt need to be manly on the front, those two things combined to really worsen the trench foot epidemic, because men would walk on frozen feet that they hadn't felt for weeks before they would actually say, I need to get off the line. That kind of stoicism was devastating, because these are the men that had to have their feet amputated.
Right. I think you're right that the foot is like the most important part of the body for an infantry person too. And also, I think the other theme you added was that they're learning to be obedient too. So there's a definite impression upon the infantrymen to follow orders and be obedient and do your job, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but most of the pressure came from each other, because they could go back to the aid station or the hospital. But the other thing that happened to them when they would go back there is they would see other people who were so much more seriously wounded than they were. And then they just turn back and say, I don't, this is not, nothing compared
to right. Somebody who'd been shot or had an arm blown off or something like that.
Right.
I think he wrote it was a significant problem, like 1,000 people a day lost. I mean, that's a huge number of people who aren't at the line fighting.
And I don't think it's really been talked about much, because the myth and the reality of U.S. soldiers and the U.S. Army was incredibly well equipped, which is true. It really is. I mean, they had an abundance of supplies, and so it had to do with more of the cherry picking that was going on, and also because the boots were made of rubber rather than leather, which is what the British did. And rubber was just a very important and needed commodity during the war, because you can't run a tank or a Jeep without tires made of rubber. So it was in some ways sort of reconstructed rubber. And the other thing that contributed to it, which the British did not have, is the rotations in the United States Army were very long. In other words, you would be at the front for weeks. And in the British Army, that would not happen. You would probably be at the front maybe a week, maybe two, as opposed to, 4 to 6 weeks. So the longer you're in the elements, the longer or the more likely you're going to get trench foot. So that was another really big factor. And, again, this was a cause of real concern. But the concern had, I think, mostly to do, and again, I read Patton's letters about this. The concern for him, anyways, was not so much about, the embodied body, the pain, the possibility of infection and amputation. For him, it was, again, it reduced units of men away from the front. And therefore, the way he looked at the body as a unit of force, it was reducing numbers of men who could fight.
Right. So there it goes back, just another body. We got to look at this not as an individual, but as a military unit, keep the body functioning. And I think you also wrote Eisenhower was concerned about trench foot in his general. So it is interesting that the Americans really didn't learn much, about World War I and had that problem. We're at about 35 minutes, Lou. Do you have anything you'd like to add? Anything I miss about the book Sheer Misery?
Well, I do have a chapter on wounding. Could I talk about that?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Yeah. So before, you and I were talking about how the wound has been so sensationalized in popular military history. Someone like Rick Atkinson or Anthony Beaver, they always talk about the most sensationalized wounds, like intestines falling out of your body, or your eyeballs falling out or whatever. And like 98% of wounds were not like that. And so I tried to just talk about banal wounds, wounds that everybody got day to day. And I talked about how the meaning of the wound changes. And I'll just give you 2 examples. One is soldiers classified wounds. What was the worst possible wound you could get? And you probably are thinking exactly what I'm thinking. No one wanted to go home without their genitals. That was considered the worst possible wound. The second one is more interesting. The second most dreaded wound was fire wounds from being inside a tank when it was hit by artillery, because the men would come out and they would have burns all over their body, and they suffered enormously before they died. The third was going blind. That was really, really horrible. And then, there was something called the $1 million wound. And the $1 million wound, it was called the, it had a name. The British had a name for it too. It's slipping my mind right now. That was the wound that was bad enough to get you off the front, but not so bad to disable you forever. Okay. It was the Blimey wound for the British, because Blimey is the name of London. And the idea was, hey, I'm going to go to London and recuperate. So, British soldiers would say, before a battle, hey, it might be Blimey this time, you're going to get it. So, and I love the way the GI wound is money, of course, right? And so that was, you didn't want to be blind because that would disable you too much. But if you had the optimum wound would be something on the leg or the arm that doesn't cripple you. And then what happens is when the wound, when people, the stretcher, I go through the whole process, the stretcher bearers and then the medical process, and I'm dealing with the British Army in this chapter, then you become your wound. That's the second thing I wanted to talk about. So literally they would organize British field stations and hospitals by wounds. So let's say I have a wound in my head, you become a head wound. Or, heads, you're in the heads ward.
Right. Wow.
Or you become, an intestines wound. Urine intestines, like literally people say urine intestines. So as you get into the medical system, the meaning of the wound changes to focus on what exactly in your body needs to be repaired. So that's just some of the things I wanted to bring up about the wounds.
No, it is fascinating. So then, it's just that people get through that whole system from the beginning to wounding, and then you talk about the corpse, which nobody really wants to address or talk about, and you talk about how they've selectively moved people who are wounded around at night so they wouldn't panic the troops or anybody. So they're very sensitive about the bodies and the corpses and things like that. But really, fascinating book. I really love reading the book. Really great book. Yeah. So where's the best place for people to buy Sheer Misery?
I would say in brick and mortar stores, something like Barnes and Nobles. And I would say online, Amazon for sure, Barnes and Nobles. It seems to be selling incredibly well. So yeah, that's where I would purchase it.
And Lou, do you have social media or anything? If people want to reach out and contact you, how can they do so?
The best thing to do for social media, I have a public email address. It's my first and last names, Mary Roberts @WISC, WISC, as in Wisconsin.edu. I've already gotten a lot of emails mostly from sons of veterans who have now said, oh my God, spot on. You just got this so right. This is exactly what he talked about in his letters. Or also members of the armed forces who are dealing with some of these issues right now in various zones. So yeah, I'm really eager to hear from you. Yeah.
Great. And so then it's Mary Roberts @WISC.edu, correct?
That's correct.
Right. And again, the title of the book, just published April 2021, is Sheer Misery: Soldiers in Battle in World War II by Mary Louise Roberts. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that